Hey, church family, I wanted to take this opportunity to present you with another word of encouragement as we prayerfully move forward into this exciting new year. Now, as I pointed out yesterday, the mainstream media, they have an interesting way of spinning the story so that it's in line with their political agenda. For example, do you remember back in early February of 2020, that's when President Trump set out to slow the spread of COVID-19 by suspending all travel from China. But rather than applauding this decision, there were many in the mainstream media who immediately called this decision into question by accusing him of being xenophobic. That's right, they said that his decision to ban travel from China, where the virus originated, that decision was xenophobic. But then within no time at all, they were insisting that, he hadn't done enough to stop the virus, that he hadn't done enough to slow the spread. Very interesting spin. Do you remember back in March when the mainstream media filled our minds with fear after they embraced the Imperial College model, which assured us incorrectly that the novel coronavirus was going to claim the lives of 2 million Americans within a few months? It's for this reason that they immediately began to promote the nationwide lockdown of everything that's not essential. But then as it turned out, the model that they were presenting was wrong by orders of magnitude. And now we know that that's the case. And yet the media continues to promote lockdowns and mask mandates and these things that have clearly not worked. But that's their story. You remember back in June when demonstrators in Seattle took control of a Seattle police department? It was the East Precinct that they took control of. And after establishing a police-free zone, which they called Chaz, they changed the sign on the precinct from Seattle Police Department to Seattle People Department. And do you remember how the mainstream media reacted to those protesters? They praised the protesters. They even compared the atmosphere of the area known as Chaz to a block party. It was like a block party. It was just all fun and games. Do you remember back in June when CNN's host Chris Cuomo posed this question about those protests? He asked, "Please show me where it says that protests are supposed to be polite and peaceful." He then added, "I can show you that outraged citizens are what made the country what she is and led to any major milestone. To be honest, this is not a tranquil time," he says. Then Cuomo goes on to endorse all the summer riots by declaring this. He says, "Most of the major movements in American history have started at the grassroots level and at some point have turned into direct conflict with the American government." So according to CNN's Chris Cuomo, direct conflict with the American government at the grassroots level is acceptable. Well, that is, unless the conflict is being caused by those who are on the right. When it's the leftists who are rioting, hey, this is just part of, what we do as Americans. But when it's a group of fringe conservatives who are rioting, Cuomo insists that this sort of rioting is tantamount to treason and sedition. Very interesting spin. Now remember, after several months of protests in many American cities resulted in more than $2 billion of property damage, the mainstream media was quick to insist that, the protests were mostly peaceful. Most legacy media outlets cited one study which concluded that 93% of Black Lives Matter protests have been peaceful. And let's not forget about the CNN reporter, who was standing in front of a burning building in Kenosha. And below him, the Chiron read, "Fiery but mostly peaceful protests after police shooting." There was a burning building in the background, and the Chiron says fiery but mostly peaceful protest. Oh my gosh. What kind of spin is that? Now compare this to the fact that there were hundreds of thousands of peaceful protesters at the Capitol last Wednesday, and from this massive group of supporters, there was an angry mob that consisted of, a few hundred, maybe 1,000 at the most, who actually breached the Capitol doors and entered the halls of Congress. And while I completely disagree with that decision, I would never engage in any of that activity. But I can't help but to wonder, why didn't the mainstream media, present this as a mostly peaceful protest? 93% of the protesters were peacefully standing outside, even taking issue with those who entered the Capitol. And yet, the mainstream media didn't present this as a mostly peaceful protest. No, they presented this as an insurrection and as an act of treason. The mainstream media applauds the protesters who stormed the Supreme Court on that day when Kavanaugh was confirmed, but then the same media turned around and described the right-wing protesters who stormed the Capitol as armed insurrectionists. And with that being the case, I can't help but to wonder, how do they feel so justified in all of this hypocrisy? Why is it that they absolutely have no problem celebrating the leftists who attack federal buildings and basically condemn federal law enforcement for defending those federal properties, while simultaneously then condemning those on the right who engage in similar actions? How can they be such hypocrites without any shame? Well, if you haven't figured it out by now, listen, the mainstream media is clearly the propaganda arm for the left wing. And while they love to justify their point of view with their so-called fact checkers, it's crucial for every Christian to realize that the mainstream media has been manipulating the facts to match their narrative for many, many years. And listen, I'll be quick to say that there is a right-wing, information, coming from media sources as well, and right-wing news is also biased. No doubt that there's bias in the media on both sides. And with that being the case, I encourage every Christian to realize that we need the wisdom of God. We need the wisdom of God in order to have a proper perspective on all the things that are happening here in our country. And the reason why is because, listen, it's easy for us to be mentally manipulated by the reports of those who are presenting the news. All reporters have a bias, and they're all going to allow that bias to slip in to what they're telling us. And therefore, we need infinite wisdom that can come from only God. Thankfully, the Christian who is walking in the wisdom of God will be able to discern the difference between what is true and what is deception. This certainly reminds me of something that Paul wrote in Ephesians chapter 1. It's there where we find him praying for the Christians there in Ephesus. And he prayed that God would give to us the spirit of wisdom and revelation in the knowledge of him, so that the eyes of your understanding being enlightened, that you may know what is the hope of his calling, what are the riches of the glory of his inheritance in the saints, and what is the exceeding greatness of his power toward us who believe, according to the working of his mighty power, which he worked in Christ when he raised him from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly places, far above all principality and power and might and dominion, and every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in that which is to come. Paul was praying that every Christian would receive the spirit of wisdom and revelation, which is found in the knowledge of Jesus Christ, and so that the spiritual eyes of our understanding might be enlightened by the infinite wisdom of God. And this is my prayer for you as well, that the Lord would give us the wisdom that we need so that we might not fall for the half-truths and the whole lies which are presented by those who are serving the demonic principalities and the powers and the demonic dominions of the devil. And the best way to do this, listen, the best way is by simply becoming committed Christians who continue to fight the good fight of faith, and all for the glory of God.